worse by the day unless somebody gives the impression that UK PLC has got itself under some kind of grip. The idea that the bank can just sit around for 5 weeks studying in more detail what's been done.
Labour's Shadow Chancellor says Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are out of control after their mini-budget. Rachel Reeves has told the party's conference in Liverpool they have lost confidence and credibility. Vladimir Putin has granted Russian citizenship to American whistleblower Edward Snowden. The former contractor with the US National Security Agency has been living in Russia since 2013 in order to escape prosecution over leaked classified documents. And Worcester Warriors have been suspended from all rugby union competitions. The club is facing £25 million in debts. LBC markets report the FTSE 100 closed up 2 points at 70.20. The pound buys $1.06 and €1.11. LBC weather dry for most areas tonight. Few showers for Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest England. A low of 4. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Monday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. On the panel with me are Dan Jarvis, the Labour MP for Barnsley Central, former Mayor of South Yorkshire, Mary Bousted, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, and Baroness Angela Smith, leader of the Labour Party in the House of Lords. They are here in Liverpool to answer your questions, I guess predominantly on what's happening at the Labour Party conference, but obviously we want to talk about the economic situation, the effects of the mini-budget on Friday, and frankly anything else that you'd like to ask about. The number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 and do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
And for those of you thinking, why have they got 3 lefties on the panel? That's not very balanced, is it? No, it isn't. It absolutely isn't. But we are in the Labour Party conference. You couldn't smuggle a Tory MP in here if you tried, I can tell you. But it'll be the same next week. We'll have 3 Conservative representatives on the panel next week. Robert is in Leighton and has the first question. Hello, Robert.
Good evening, folks. How would Labour get inflation down to 2%? Because so far, the only anti-inflation policy we seem to get from Labour is let's tax the excess profits of energy companies, but they don't say anything else about getting inflation down to 2%.
Dan Jarvis, it's a good question, isn't it? Because it's very easy to criticise the other party, but there haven't been a lot of answers to that question, I would say, particularly in Rachel Reeves' speech today.
Well, you'll forgive me if I begin by criticising the other party, because I think if you look at this in the context of what's happened over the past few days, you've got a new Chancellor who's sacked the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, somebody who's incredibly experienced and I think would have been very well placed to provide advice to the Chancellor at this particular moment. They've silenced the Office of Budgetary Responsibility. And essentially, we've got a situation now where the markets are in free fall and there is massive concern about the state of our economy. So can you imagine, just for a moment, if we had a Labour Chancellor, can you imagine the questions that would be asked of senior ministers in a Labour government if that was the situation that we found ourselves in? And I think in Rachel Reeves, and she showed it again today, you've got someone who's got huge experience, who's spent years working as an economist at the Bank of England. And I think from the conversations I have with people back in my constituency and more generally, people now have a sense, and this is hard won, but they have a sense that Labour is better placed to make these very difficult decisions when it comes to inflation, when it comes to the economy. Our country is facing massive financial pressures, and I think it is almost impossible now to have confidence in the new government and their policies and the decisions that they are taking. I accept that that means that there will be a greater scrutiny on our policies, and I think from Rachel Reeves today, in terms of the really sort of good common sense things that she was saying, and I think in terms of what you'll hear from Keir Starmer tomorrow, I hope that people really do now have a sense that we have got an analysis of the challenges that the country faces that means that we would be much better placed with a Labour government and with a Labour Chancellor.
I deliberately didn't interrupt you there because I was waiting for you to answer the question, how would Labour get inflation down?
Yeah, I was trying to make the point that I think you have to look at these things in the round. So look at what we've seen over the past few days.
Answer the question. I mean, what would Labour's policies be to get inflation down?
Well, if you listen to what Rachel was saying today, and if you look at the policies that are being brought forward, and I'm sure that you'll hear more from that from Keir Starmer tomorrow, I think increasingly, and as I say, from the conversations that I have, when you look at the decisions that would be made in the round, when you look at the proposals that Rachel Reeves was bringing forward today, so clarity about the fact that the decision that was taken in the mini-budget that wasn't a mini-budget on Friday in terms of getting rid of the top rate of tax and the revenue that would generate and being very clear about how that money would be invested. Our NHS is under massive pressure. She's brought forward real proposals that I think will resonate with the challenges that people are seeing in their own communities. So looking at these things in the round, and look, we all accept
I don't want to look at things in the round. I want to hear from you how Labour would get inflation down, and you don't seem to be able to answer the question.
But the point I'm seeking to make is that the analysis that is being advanced by our Shadow Chancellor and her team, I think, is the right one. We're not in government, and clearly it's our responsibility to hold the government to account. There is a sort of very fast-moving situation at the moment, and I think that most people that I've had conversations with would be much more comforted and reassured if you got Rachel Reeves.
Well, I don't think they're going to be very comforted and reassured by your answers, frankly, because you still haven't given me a single policy that would get inflation down, apart from saying trust Rachel Reeves.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty good starting point in all of this. But I understand why you make the challenge, but look at what we've seen. If you've got a plan that leads to a historical devaluing of the pound, if you're anticipating a likely emergency interest rate rise, you've got mortgage lenders today withdrawing mortgage products. And we are just a matter of days into this new government. None of that bodes particularly well. You've got Conservative MPs who entirely understandably are expressing their discomfort at the decisions that they're seeing. And it feels to me like a moment of huge challenge for our country, and it feels to me like we've got a government who is just not fit and able to take the decisions that are required. And if you look at the emphasis of the mini-budget, at a point of great crisis where families right around the country are really struggling to make ends meet, with winter around the corner, with huge additional pressures on household budgets, Where's the analysis from the government about what they're going to do to make a difference in that?
The traditional way of getting inflation down, or one of the ways, is to put up interest rates. And you've just hinted there that obviously, I mean, look, we all know what the effect of that would be on mortgage rates, so it would affect individual people massively. But what I'm trying to establish is what are the alternatives to hitting people with higher mortgage rates if you're going to get inflation down? Because that was, I mean, I remember back to the Labour government of the late 1970s when inflation ran riot, and they did start to get inflation down towards the end of that government. It is true. And can you learn any lessons from that?
Yeah, of course you can. In the end, politics is about priorities, isn't it? It's about how you cut the cake and the decisions that you make. And at this point of challenge for our country, what was it that we heard on Friday? We heard a message from the government about basically enabling bankers to earn bigger bonuses. Now, I don't think we've got any bankers in my constituency, but what we have got is a lot of people who are genuinely fearful in a way that I've not experienced in my time in politics, who genuinely don't know how they're going to heat the house over the coming winter, are worried about how they're going to put food on the table. I mean, I suspect many of your listeners will have heard the terrible story that was on social media earlier on about a kid at school pretending to eat food out of a lunchbox because they were too ashamed to admit there wasn't enough money in the household so that kid could go to school with some food. What does that say about where we are as a country? What does it say about the priorities of this government? And I think increasingly people get a sense that this government has run out of steam, doesn't have any ideas that are going to benefit the country in the whole, and increasingly are looking to a Labour Party to do things in a different way. And I think that we shouldn't be remotely complacent about it, but that presents all sorts of opportunities, and we've got to make sure that we're organised and lined up to take those opportunities.
Mary Bousted, you're not a Labour MP, you're a trade union leader. Robert's question was, how would Labour get inflation down? What would your advice be?
Well, I think the inflation is being caused by events actually outside the government's control up till now, apart from when Friday's budget, you can't say that any longer. So they're caused by the war in Ukraine and the increase in gas prices. How are you going to get that down from 10% CPI and 12% RPI is really difficult. It's a very difficult and long-term project. And if you raise interest rates now, they will be raised. That is going to cause massive, we've already seen that public services, the spending review, which was promised by Liz Truss, has been abandoned. So we've just done some analysis today, and the effect on secondary schools and primary schools, many of whom will see less than a 1% real term rise in per pupil funding, is going to be, and hospitals, it's going to be absolutely dramatic. So obviously, before Friday, Labour's approach to the energy crisis, which is a really big windfall tax upon the energy companies who have made massive profits for no reason other than a massive rise in prices. That was one way of dealing with the rise in energy prices and protecting people against that without having to put that burden on the taxpayer, which will in the long term cause massive problems. How many generations will we be paying for that? So there was always going to be, I'm not an economist and I'm not a member of the Labour Party, I'm not access to their thinking, but it seems to me...
You're not a member of the Labour Party?
Sorry, I am a member of the Labour Party. Sorry, I'm not a Labour MP.
Hold the front page.
No. I'm not a Labour MP and I'm not party to the government. But it seems to me there was always going to be a massive problem with inflation. It was always going to be really difficult to get it down because of world events. My contribution to this is what happened on Friday made that much worse. And I would just have to say, being an ex-teacher, and then a teacher trainer, you teach teachers to write their lesson plan, do their workings out, get their evidence, and justify what they're doing. And what happened on Friday, I'm still gobsmacked by it. I just don't know whether it's arrogance, ignorance.
It's really interesting what you just said there about the sort of lesson plan thing, because they were under so much pressure to do a mini budget because of the cost of living crisis, and they got into power on the 6th. Well, I know it's a continuity government in some ways, but it is a new government on the 6th of September. And what was it, the 23rd of September, so literally only 2 weeks later, did a budget. Well, I remember saying on this programme halfway through that, well, how can you create a budget in 2 weeks?
Yes.
And we're now seeing the consequences of that. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
And just to carry on, how do you do a budget without having the Office for Budget Responsibility costing it? And then to say, well, they're going to cost it on the 23rd of November, 6 more weeks. And the Bank of England, we will not hesitate to act. And they've hesitated to act. They've obviously been working in very close concert today, and they've not calmed the markets down at all, because the markets were looking for a rise in interest rates in order to cope with these unfunded tax cuts, on top of, I think, the very poor decision they made about energy, and the way they put the energy prices onto the consumer, onto the taxpayer. So I think getting inflation down was always going to be a long, hard job, and what's happened on Friday has made it immeasurably worse.
Angela Smith, somebody on a text here says, surely the Labour conference is the time above all other when they have to say what they will do. I'm left-leaning, but at the end of my patience. I mean, that I think is partly in response to what Dan was saying, but I mean, going back to the main question, how would Labour get inflation down?
Well, I think the second call is a bit unfair, really. If you heard Rachel today, it was quite detailed, and as Johnny Reynolds was speaking the same, Ed Miliband on energy, and you'll see more flesh on the bones as we go along. But two things to pick up on what's been said already. One is the point you made when you were discussing this before, was that the traditional method, you'd say to the Bank of England would say, we're putting up interest rates since it was given independence by the Labour government, and that will correct inflation. And what we've seen is very little action or smaller action, and it's not had the impact because we've seen other factors that don't follow the traditional pattern that we expect the economy to. Now, you and I spoke a few weeks ago, and back to the point that Robert made, he said, apart from the windfall tax, what plans has Labour got to tackle the rise in inflation and bring it down? The windfall tax on its own doesn't bring down inflation, but what it would have done is it would have stopped energy bills rising so high. That would have had an impact on inflation.
Hang on, they've already done that.
No, let me finish. No, it hasn't. What the government's doing, it's letting people have high bills and it's helping them pay them. The money is going to the producers and the suppliers of energy. What we were saying is you stop them rising. You don't put those bills on the customer in the first place. That would have an impact. And the plans we had costed showed something like 2% reduction on inflation from where we are now. But you've got to have, Mary's quite right on this, and Dan is as well, you've got to have a longer term plan that brings into other factors. So if you listen to the energy plan that Ed Miliband was talking about today, as you get more generation within the UK, by solar, by wind power, and that includes onshore wind, which the government has ruled out, and it's one of the cheapest, quickest ways. I've lost track of how they're moving around now. Good, get on with it.
I didn't know this until who was telling me this today? Somebody who knew what they were talking about anyway. And they said this is something that no one's noticed, that they've actually given permission now for more onshore wind.
Well, I hope they haven't told some of the Tory party members, because that's what stopped it happening the first time. That's one of the quickest.
I'm not a fan of that policy, but there we are.
But it's a lot better, Ian, than the kind of prices we're seeing and the reliance on overseas supplies that we've seen with Russia and what's happened in the Ukraine. That's more difficult. So there's got to be this longer term plan that the economy's stronger, because that's the only way we see prices come down. But what you can't do is just sit back and let the market correct this. It's not going to happen. It's got to be intervention by government. It's got to be taking action to tackle the cost of living, part of that being the windfall tax. But if we don't tackle the cost of living, and that means fuel prices, etc., then we're not going to see inflation come down. So I think it's going to be harder than was expected. I think the actions, as Mary says, the government took on Friday, which a lot of us are still trying to fathom out why and how they did that, it seems bizarre, seem to be contrary to everything that serious economists say you should do. That's all going to make it harder. And the predictions it could go up to 6% in the next few months are really quite alarming. So tonight, I think there's people who have sleepless nights about this. I don't have any faith in this government to be able to bring down inflation. I don't think that's really where they are. But it's going to be a longer term, it's going to be strategic investment, bringing prices down and invest in areas that help the consumer. Otherwise, it's going to continue to increase.
Thank you all very much. We'll come to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060973 if you'd like to ask our panel another question. Lots of them coming in. You can text them to 84850. And as I always say, I hope you're watching us on Global Player. It is 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
LBC.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 21 minutes past 8 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question. Our guests are Dan Jarvis, Labour MP for Barnsley Central, former Mayor of South Yorkshire, Mary Bousted, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, and Baroness Angela Smith, Leader of the Labour Party in the House of Lords. I always feel I should call you Milady.
Lady Ange.
But I knew you when you were Dead Commons.
I'm still Dead Common.
We're both from Essex. We can relate.
Yeah,
to
we can
that,
do
can't
this.
Right, let's go to our next question. It's from Jürgen in Balham. It's a text question. He says, with the Labour Party mirroring Joe Biden's bottom-up view of economic growth, do the panel believe that Labour are better positioned than the Conservatives to land a trade deal with the United States? Mary?
I think they probably are, yes. I think for two reasons that Labour would be more sympathetically. I don't think a trade deal in the USA is at all interested, because the Americans cut a mean trade deal and want it absolutely in their own interests. Why wouldn't they? But I think for two reasons. I think Joe Biden's statement that trickle-down economics don't work, I think that is the view of the Labour Party, and there would be a synergy of views there. I also think that Joe Biden would believe that the Labour Party would not break treaties and not break the treaties and the promises they made for the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think that Joe Biden would presume and assume, and I think rightly, that Labour would honour its promises and its treaties over the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Angela, isn't it as simple as there's a Republican president, they're more likely to do it with the Conservatives, a Democratic president would be more likely to do it with Labour?
No, I don't think it sort of measures across in quite the same way. I'm sort of used to the nice things about Democrat candidates in the past as well, so it's not quite the same. I think there are two things. Mary's hit the nail on the head about the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Americans have always been very interested in the Northern Ireland peace process. When we were in government leading up to that Good Friday Agreement, the American government was very much involved. They've been very sympathetic, and they're pretty appalled at the way we're behaving. We've got the Northern Ireland Protocol legislation coming into the Lords shortly, and basically what we have is an agreement, a protocol that the government told us was absolutely essential for the Good Friday Agreement. Now they're saying that same protocol that they negotiated, they signed, they agreed, is the worst thing, and we've got to get rid of it to protect the Good Friday Agreement. So the government's got themselves into a right old pickle.
Well, they would say that the way it's operating shows that it doesn't work. And to be fair to them, all of the Northern Ireland parties agree that there are aspects of the protocol that aren't working.
And I do as well. And there's ways to resolve that.
You should say you're a former Northern Ireland minister.
I spent 3.5 years as Northern Ireland minister. It's an issue very close to my heart. I'm speaking to Northern Ireland business while I'm here. The way to deal with problems of the protocol, it was never going to be easy, because never before has the island of Ireland, north and south, one been in the EU and one out. So that creates immediately complications. But we're not talking about great issues of principle, we're talking about practicalities. And these are negotiable. You could deal with the veterinary agreement straight away, that would help. But I think the Americans are very upset that the Good Friday Agreement, which they worked with us on, they supported, could be wrecked by the government's carelessness and ideological approach to this. So that is very damaging for a trade deal. And I think Liz Truss not meeting Biden when he was in London last week is quite damaging to us. So there's a better way of doing it. I'm not going to say it's is the best thing ever. I'm saying the way to deal with it is to negotiate and discuss it, and have somebody from Northern Ireland in the room when you're having those discussions. Indeed, have them in Belfast, neither of which the government has done so far. So that's, I think, is hugely damaging to getting a trade deal. On the trickle-down economics, the idea that you give lots of money to rich people and the wealth just trickles down and finds its way to everybody else is pretty much bonkers, isn't it? So I think on that...
Well, it isn't.
It is. Well, it is, Iain. You can't do that on its own.
No. I'm saying it isn't. Wealth. If all of the people who get extra wealth then invest that money in new companies which provide jobs, but of course they don't. That's the point.
Yeah, it does. Precisely.
It's one of those things where the theory, you can see the theory can work, but in practice it doesn't.
No, it's part of a theory as well. You have to have intervention. And the people who make wealth in this country, as Rachel was really clear about, as Keir was very clear about, and Johnny Reynolds was, the people who make wealth in this country aren't just the investors. They're people who are working in companies. They're producing, they're manufacturing, they're teaching, they're nurses, they're doctors. These people generate wealth. So it's got to be from the bottom up, the middle out, and the top down. It all comes together. So I think we're aligned with Joe Biden very much on the kind of economy we need to do, how we can grow the economy. So we're not aligned with them in terms of economic policy, if we take the government's view. we're been playing fast and loose, or the government's playing fast and loose with the Good Friday Agreement. That doesn't create a great environment for doing a deal. And then you've got, how can you be trusted if as soon as there's a problem with the protocol, rather than using the mechanisms that are already agreed to try and resolve it, you say, we'll put legislation in through Parliament and kick it out and get rid of it.
But they say they have used those mechanisms.
They haven't. They have not invoked
ball.
Article 16, so they haven't used those mechanisms.
So you think they should do that?
That would be a better approach. I think they should have to have negotiations and sit down and discuss it sensibly like grown-ups before I go in and knock their heads together. But they're not using the mechanisms are there. They're putting legislation through Parliament that tells the rest of the world we can't be trusted. That's not a good route to get trade deals.
Dan?
I think we have to be honest about the fact that whoever's the Prime Minister and whoever's the President, securing a trade deal with the United States would not be an easy, simple or quick thing. It would be a very long, complicated process that would take some time. Albeit, of course, it would be remiss of me not to remind your listeners that there were actually some prominent politicians who said it would be quite an easy thing for us to achieve. And I think that they hopefully are understanding that those assurances that were given some years ago were misplaced at best. To come to Jürgen's point directly, because I think it is a good question, I agree with both what Mary and Angela said. I think actually Keir Starmer as a Labour Prime Minister would be better placed, because I think some of this comes down to credibility and trust. I think there are big questions for our country at the moment. I worry that we've lost or are losing the art of statecraft. I think that Britain is still sort of searching for a role and a purpose in a post-Brexit world. I think that the ongoing incredibly difficult situation in Ukraine and the UK's participation in NATO actually has provided some opportunities to work more closely with other countries. But at the end of the day, it is about credibility and trust, and it's about doing the hard yards of work with politicians, with officials, to try to hammer out the basis of a deal. And that's not something that you could do quickly or easily. It will require a sustained period of negotiation, and you'll need some proper grown-up conversations. We talk a bit about the special relationship and the relationship that we have with
I always cringe when I hear that phrase.
Well,
it seems so craven to me.
Some people do, but it's been mentioned recently, both I think by President Biden and I think also by Liz Truss as well. I think we should seek to have the best possible relationship with presidents of the United States, but as part of a strategy for how we're going to engage in the wider world. We had something, people will remember, called Global Britain. I don't know whether that is still the policy of His Majesty's government. Forgive me. I'm not convinced at all that it is. But what we need to see from the British government is grown-up dialogue with our friends and neighbours and those people that we're perhaps not quite so friendly with, so that Britain can seek to play a meaningful contribution in the world. There's great instability at the moment, not least with Ukraine, which I mentioned. We have to forge a path now outside of the European Union, and that does involve establishing trading locations trading relationships right around the world. And of course, the relationship with the United States is a critical one. I think we are better placed to do it, but let's not pretend for one moment that it would be an easy thing to secure.
Can I just say something really quickly, because it hasn't been mentioned? No one should ever estimate the importance to an Irish Catholic president of the island of Ireland and to peace on the island of Ireland, and anything which, in their view, threatens that peace on the island of Ireland, they will do anything they can not to have that peace threatened. And so, whilst Liz Truss is threatening the Northern Ireland Protocol, there's no way to even begin talking. I mean, I understand that Biden didn't do a bilateral meeting with her.
Well, he did at the UN.
He did at the UN,
yeah.
But not before that. And he won't if he thinks that there is a danger of a cessation of peace on the island of Ireland.
The Irish lobby in democratic politics has to be seen to be believed, doesn't it? It really does. And I don't say that in a disparaging way. It's actually rather impressive, the I would say disproportionate power that they do wield over democratic.
But it's also been helpful as well, because when we were negotiating for the Good Friday Agreement, the American government, the Irish government all worked together with us to bring peace to Northern Ireland. That was so important. And I think they feel an investment in that. Interestingly, if you talk to businesses in Northern Ireland, they are really quite anxious about the legislation to end the protocol because they're trying to make it work. And one thing business needs, especially at the moment when the economy is doing so badly, is certainty. And this constant switching about by the government isn't giving businesses the certainty they need. So they've got some really thoughtful, good ideas about how to resolve the issues. It doesn't involve sort of forcing legislation through and just ditching the whole thing. It's actually being pragmatic to try and make it work as best they possibly can.
Great stuff. We'll come to more of your questions in a moment. Jürgen, thank you very much for that. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31 News Headlines with Serena Farrow.
The Chancellor says he'll reveal more details on how his growth plan will be implemented on November the 23rd. The Treasury says a medium-term fiscal plan will be set out alongside forecasts for growth and borrowing. It says the pound continues to slide against the dollar. A UK court will hear the case of a US citizen accused of killing Harry Dunn for the first time this week. 45-year-old Anne Sakoulas is accused of causing the teenage motorcyclist's death by dangerous driving in August 2019. And Vladimir Putin has granted Russian citizenship to American whistleblower Edward Snowden. The former contractor with the US National Security Agency has been living in Russia since 2013. It's to escape prosecution over leaked classified documents. LBC weather staying dry for most areas tonight. Little rain though for Northern Ireland, Wales and southwest of England with a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35. We have Mary Bousted with us, Joint Secretary of the National Education Union, Dan Jarvis, Labour MP for Barnsley Central, and Angela Smith, Baroness Smith, leader of the Labour Party in the House of Lords. I nearly said leader of the House of Lords, which would be elevating you somewhat, wouldn't it?
Give it time.
Right, let's go to another question. We have Terry in Watford. Hello, Terry.
Hi, Ian. Hi, panel.
Hi there, Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Hi. I feel a Basildon moment coming. Therefore, what economic principles should Labour fight the next election on?
We should point out that Angela used to be the MP for Basildon, and Basildon has always been quite famous in politics, hasn't it? For David Amos's victory in '83, and then it was the seat in 1992 where we all thought that's it for Labour. The Tories have won.
Yeah, I must admit, I was probably the only person in the country that still thought we were going to win the election, because I'd been involved in the Basildon campaign and thought, this doesn't look good on the ground, perhaps it's just Basildon. So, yeah, and of course I use my title as Basildon, my hometown.
Indeed. So, which economic principle should Labour fight the next election around, Angela?
I think it's a number. Growth comes first, but I think it's got to be not just sort of quick fix answers to things, but long-term investment in the technologies of the future. So things we were saying today about green growth, what are we going to need for the future? What are the skills we're going to need for that? So I think it's around skills and growth. It has to be, as well, I think, looking at inflation and prices. It has to be an economic policy that covers the whole country. It's very easy to stimulate growth in a few sort of urban centres, but to get that spread out, it's a bit more of a challenge. There's some more work to be announced and sort of finalised on this that we're doing at the moment, of how you get investment down to lower levels. It's also got to be government in partnership. I was talking to businesses earlier today. You can't expect businesses, and this is part of the conversation we were having earlier, Ian, about the trickle-down economics. You say to business, wealth people, here's some more money, you get on with it. It's got to be a partnership. Government's got to create the climate and sometimes the investment itself to look at what the technologies you want in the future. If you look at the example, electric cars, huge advances being made in electric cars, but the issue is batteries. In every single country that is doing battery production, the government's a partner, except in here where it's not happening. So there's quite a, I suppose it is growth at the end of the day, but it's also, I think, Terry, it needs to be stability, because you can't have this sort of rising growth and then it crashes down. So it's growth, it's stability, and it's trying to share that growth around the country. I think that's the basis of it.
Dan Jarvis, before we get into this, you were Mayor of South Yorkshire, and in a sense, I guess in that role, you would have had a bit of experience of this, trying to sort of regenerate areas of South Yorkshire that needed it. What were your economic principles when you were mayor?
Well, the primary principle was, as a Labour mayor, seeking to work with a Conservative government for the betterment of our communities. I think the fundamental economic principle that I'd begin with is one of fairness. And I don't know what Terry thinks, but I suspect most people actually want to see policy making that is evidence-based, not based on ideology. We used to hear a lot about levelling up, unlocking growth from right around the country. Basildon is a fantastic place. Let me just take you for a moment from Basildon to Barnsley, because I think one of the greatest tragedies, which goes back generations, and there is fault on both sides of the political divide about, is our complete inability to unlock the huge amount of potential that exists outside of London and the southeast of England. This should never be a competition. It's not about, and I can't stand the kind of sort of north versus south debate. That's not what this is about. This is about how we can seek to reduce and eliminate regional inequalities so that every kid, wherever they're growing up, gets the best possible start in life. Now, to be fair to the previous Prime Minister, that was a really important agenda for him. Now, you can take a view about how successful he was at it, and it was a real frustration of mine that as a mayor, I wanted to work closely with a Conservative government. I wanted to support the levelling up agenda. I wanted to unlock economic prosperity and drive growth for my residents in South Yorkshire. But there just was never the sort of sense of a plan as to how that was going to be done, nor was the sort of transformative levels of resource that would be required to do it. People sometimes think
That partly why you stood down?
It was a factor, because at the end of the day, I reached the conclusion, whilst the Metro Mayor jobs, they're incredibly important. There's a huge amount that you can do, and actually I think for the Labour Party, the excellent work of our regional Metro Mayors really can act as a shop window for what can be achieved nationally. But in the end, it is, and I'm a great believer in devolving power, the more you can place political decision making closer to the people who are affected by it, absolutely the better. But with the system we've got at the moment, what happens in Westminster and Whitehall is absolutely critical. And it doesn't seem to me that the previous government had the basis of a sort of transformative plan. I was just going to make one final point with your indulgence, Ian. People sometimes think I'm a little bit eccentric when I start talking about East Germany. But bear with me.
Part of my degree was on East German history, so I'm with you all the way.
Let's do it then. But if you look at the process of reunification of Germany and the amount of resource that was invested into the former East Germany to try and get that up and level up East Germany so that you would have sort of some sense of parity right across the country of Germany, that required a massive, sustained programme of economic investment to drive that economic growth and basically reduce those regional inequalities. And they've done it much better and much more effectively in Germany than we do it here. So the economic principle that I would like to see is actually a coherent plan to unlock the potential of the country. And that is not just the advantage of, and it isn't just about the north of England, you know, there are coastal areas that are hugely deprived and require economic investment. It's not just for the betterment of those particular areas, it's actually for the benefit of the whole country, because we will only be truly successful if every corner of the United Kingdom gets that support and gets that investment. And we are a long way, frankly, from having the basis of a plan to do that.
Mary?
So I think the big mistake that was made on Friday was the simplistic belief that tax cuts would lead to economic growth through trickle-down economics, because businesses don't invest because of tax cuts. They invest because there's a stable government, with a stable economic situation, and where there is a skilled workforce which are able to be highly productive. So that is the principle that I would work on, that we need to really start looking at how do we develop a skilled workforce which is able to be employed in highly skilled jobs, which will pay well, which will give people money to spend in their local economies and to fuel economic growth. And Dan's absolutely right, that can't just be London. We've got to take the heat off London. We've had a government for the last 12 years, as Schools Minister Nick Gibb, who wouldn't let the word skills be written into any government document.
Why?
Because it was about knowledge. It was about powerful knowledge. So not only was the word skills couldn't be written down, neither could the word learning. I learnt yesterday by a senior civil servant. It had to be teaching children as passive learners, learning chunks of knowledge. He thought the skills debate, and he said this to me on several occasions, that was just wishy-washy. So we've got an education system which does not promote the skills agenda. We've starved FE of funding. FE will be, in real terms, still worse funded in 2025.
Before people think you're being rude, further education.
Further education, that's right. We've starved further educational funding. We've starved vocational educational funding. And so we have to create the conditions. My economic principles will be an education system which absolutely is focused on knowledge, which develops skills, which provides a skilled workforce, which provides the conditions where companies will invest, and the government has to do that on top of infrastructure projects which will allow much better transport in the regions. I mean, you know, if I want to get from Bolton to Preston on the bus, which I did 2 weeks ago, it takes hours. So we need decent transport in the region so that people can go and get the good jobs. And finally, my principle will be that people don't work for their poverty, that we have decent wages. And that means Labour's promise today of a proper living wage. You know,
what does that mean to you, like now in 2022? What is a proper living wage per hour?
Per hour, I don't know, because the Low Pay Commission takes a huge amount of economics. The TUC's called for £15 an hour. That appears to me to be a good place to start.
Okay. Right, we're going to go to a break on time for once, which is very unusual on my programme. But we will come back with more questions. 0345 6060 973, including this one from Hugh, who's a veteran in Battersea, says, when will Dan run for leader? We'll leave that question hanging. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Chloe Smith is Conservative MP and Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. There's some headlines in some of the papers that there could be the first cabinet row over the necessity for an increase to migration for areas such as agriculture and others. Do you recognise the row, and whose side are you on?
Ideally, I would like that to be British workers. I think we've got a great opportunity here to help British businesses fill their vacancies.
Will we see people brought in from overseas to fill agriculture and social care jobs?
I think it's perfectly possible for that to happen, and I'm quite comfortable with that.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC. Risk. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:49 is the time on LBC. Right, let's go to our next question. It's a caller from Steve in Manor Park. Hello, Steve.
Hi, nice to meet you again. A quick one, really, for the Labour people that you have there. I'm normally just quickly a Labour supporter, a Labour member. I'm not now. After watching the documentary, I won't mention it. I'm wondering if we need to have trust in the Labour Party and in Keir Starmer and the people running the Labour Party at the moment. After the investigation that I've watched, have they got anything to say about what's happened with regards to Jeremy Corbyn.
Let's not be coy here. You're referring to a documentary on Al Jazeera, which I was actually invited to be interviewed on, and I declined it, partly because I couldn't do it at the time they wanted. But they didn't actually tell me. They said, it's all about Labour and the media. It's a sort of very airy-fairy subject. I haven't seen it either, but it is making allegations about Jeremy Corbyn being treated badly by particularly Labour officials while he was leader. Now, Angela, you probably have more experience of this than anyone.
I have no idea about a documentary or what it is, so I feel I'm in the dark about this one. But I was in the Shadow Cabinet when Jeremy was leader. I've worked with Jeremy, and I think he was the wrong person to lead the Labour Party. And
you were happy to work under him.
I'm elected by the Labour peers, and I will work with who the Labour Party elects to be leader. I am much more comfortable and happy with Keir Starmer as leader, who I think is doing a great job.
Right. Did you see any evidence that Labour officials were deliberately undermining Jeremy Corbyn?
Absolutely none whatsoever. The person who most undermined Jeremy was Jeremy, as far as I could see.
Mary?
I haven't watched the documentary, and I don't know about this, so I don't. Genuinely,
this could be a very quick round.
Yeah.
Dan?
I haven't watched it either, but I think the gist of Steve's point was, could he have trust in the Labour Party led by Keir Starmer? And the answer to that question is yes. I've known Keir Starmer for a number of years, and I think there's an important debate about standards in public life. And I think there is a sense, certainly from the conversations that I have with people, that they've felt very let down by the behaviour of the most recent Prime Minister in recent time. And actually, I think if you look at Keir Starmer and look at the principles by which he lives his life, look at the way in which he's lived his life, I think people can have absolute trust and confidence in him that he will always do the right thing, that he will stand up for what he believes to be right, and that he will speak truth to power whenever there's a requirement to do so. So I think they can look at him, who's someone who's got the integrity
his
and
opponents,
the trust.
I mean, let's use Owen Jones as an example here, who is accusing Keir Starmer of ditching all of the promises, the 10 promises that he made during his leadership campaign. He's ditched the whole lot of them. How can you trust somebody who does that, who says something to get into power and then ditches the promises afterwards?
Well, I don't think that anybody should be massively surprised that in the context of electing leaders, there will be a conversation that will be had with the selectorate and there will be a conversation around what the priorities of the party are going to be. And it's entirely legitimate in the context of a leadership election that conversation will happen. Keir Starmer has transformed the fortunes of the Labour Party. I mean, I was a candidate in the general election in 2019, and I was physically confronted on the street talking to traditionally rock-solid Labour voters in my heartland constituency in Yorkshire. That's where we got to in 2019. It's just the reality of the situation. In a relatively short space of time, we're now here at this Labour conference where I have to say there is the most upbeat sense of feeling that I've experienced in a very, very long time, where you can see the tectonic plates of British politics starting to move. You can see a Labour Party that is getting ready and organised to take on the huge challenges that the country faces. And that has been under Keir Starmer's leadership. So I think the transformative activity that we've seen in recent time brings great credit on him. I am proud that he's the leader of the Labour Party. I think he'd be an excellent Prime Minister, and I don't think anybody should have any doubt about being able to place their faith and trust in him, because I think he's someone of real integrity, someone who genuinely believes in public service and who is in politics, not for what he can get out of it, like some people, but for what he can put into it.
Right, Steve, thank you for that. Let's go to Jason in Westminster. Hello, Jason.
Hi, and long time since I've spoken to you. A question really aimed at the progressives more on the panel. As we draw closer to an election...
I think they'd all say they were progressives.
Well, yes, I didn't want to name names, so, they can all wear the cap. I don't mind.
Okay.
As we draw closer to an election, do they not think that it's time the leaderships of the progressive parties promoted tactical voting? It's something that's happened in the past, but it's tended to happen on a local level, certainly within the Labour Party. And I just think that coming from mainstream leadership, would be, really quite a good thing. As was proven a year, 18 months ago, when Labour and the Lib Dems both won by-elections, because the other party's supporters switched in both cases.
I'm going to take a bet here now, and they don't like tactical voting. Dan?
Well, my advice is always to tactically vote Labour.
But do you, particularly in by-elections, do you understand why people do sometimes vote tactically?
I do understand it. I think politicians have got to be really careful about telling people how to vote. I think in the end what we're there to do is try and convince the public to support us, to invest their faith and trust in us and our policies, and that is the best way to proceed. All of that said, I think certainly in the context of a by-election, I do understand that people will sensibly take a view that actually they don't want the Conservatives to be elected or re-elected or whatever it might be, and will take a pragmatic decision about who they think is best placed to win that seat. I think that is an entirely reasonable position for people to adopt, but I don't think that really it is the role of elected politicians to guide them to that particular choice. I think that is a conclusion that they have to reach themselves. And I think, as a Labour MP, what I will always want to do is be knocking on the doors and be out there making the case for why people should support Labour.
Mary?
Well, I voted tactically. I've been a Labour member for many decades, but I used to live in Kingston in South West London. There is no way you're going to get a Labour MP in Kingston in South West London. You've got a fighting chance of a Lib Dem MP, and I will vote anyway to defeat the Tory. So, and I think that, the by-elections, I've forgotten where they are now, but...
West Lancashire is one.
Yeah. People will vote tactically to get the government out. And when you look at the boundary changes that are being made, the advantages which the Tories are giving themselves, then, people will vote tactically. I mean, for the next election, unless Labour gets about 15 seats in Scotland, it's going to be very difficult for them to get an overall majority. And so, we're looking at, I think, Labour as the largest party with having to do a confidence and supply with other parties. I think that is going to be the reality of what happens unless there is a real turnaround of fortunes in Scotland. So the electorate is intelligent. The electorate will decide what colour of government they want, and they will vote to try and support it. And I think that cat's out of the bag. You've got the websites which can tell you very clearly which way to vote tactically. So I'm no idealist about this. I'm no purist. I want the Tories out.
Angela?
Call me old-fashioned, but I think in an ideal world you vote for what you believe in, not just what you want to vote against. And so you should be voting for the party that closely represents your views. I think it's also very arrogant of political parties to say, we're not sure if we can win here, so we think you, who've previously voted for me, should vote for somebody else. How arrogant to assume you know how your voters are going to vote and that who they would vote for the second choice.
Well, obviously I must remain strictly impartial on this, but bloody well said.
So, I love your impartiality, I really do. So I think it's a really difficult one. And tactical voting, I think there is an intelligence in voters who make up their own minds, but they can get it wrong. And I remember when Labour first lost Basildon, when it split into 2 seats and Harvey Proctor was elected, the reason was the SDP came along and they said, we can best win here. And the result was the Tory won when it was a Labour seat because it split the vote. So if people want to vote tactically, it has to be done intelligently, but I'm not going to advocate it to anybody.
Just briefly, because we're going to be talking about this in the next hour, proportional representation. The platform lost the vote here at the conference today, and the conference voted for proportional representation. Keir Starmer doesn't want PR. I know, Angela, you're against it.
Well, it's more than that, to be honest, because look what's happening in the world. Look what's happened today with all the news we've got. We've got the economy tanking, we've got a government doesn't know what to do, and we're talking about internal voting systems. You can't do anything about a voting system or anything else unless you're in power. So I just think it's not a priority for me. The priority for me is getting the economy up and running again, giving people jobs, and actually reclaiming a place in the world that we can be proud as a country again.
Mary?
I don't think the debate is now for PR. I instinctively incline towards a first-past-the-post system.
Dan?
At a Labour Party conference, I entirely understand why people want to have these discussions and debates. And as a mayor, I was elected under a different system from first past the post, and that's probably actually a better system. But I completely agree with Angela and Mary. Given the huge pressures on our country that we face at the moment, I think people will perhaps be a little bit sort of bewildered why we're spending a huge amount of time talking about it. So an important issue, yes, but absolutely not a priority for right now.
And your view on it? Oh, come on.
So as a mayor, there was a single transferable vote system, which I think probably is a better system, actually. But the government have moved the single transferable system away from mayors. So mayors are now elected on a first-past-the-post arrangement. I think there probably are better systems out there, and I think it's important that you have a view and you look at these things for the longer term. But I just don't think anybody really thinks that is a priority for right now. No one's mentioned it to me in my constituency. But I do understand why people want to have the debate, and that's fair enough.
Final text question from Jim in Liverpool. It's great to have you in Liverpool, Iain. What is your panelist's favourite thing about this gorgeous city? Mary?
I love the Mersey. I really like this conference centre, actually.
Even though the food is almost non-existent,
yeah.
It's freezing cold and the internet's rubbish.
Yeah, but I think it's one of my favourite conference centres.
All right,
It's
okay.
I like
to think what the others are like.
Yeah, well, have you tried Brighton recently?
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I've probably got in trouble for doing that. And I'm sorry, Brighton. And I also just love the city itself. Driving through the city on a Saturday night, it's just fantastic, the atmosphere in the city.
You need to stop and get out. Angela?
Yeah.
I'll say three things. Billy Fury statue, the great museum down at the Albert Docks, but the thing I've really enjoyed this time, more than any other, every time you go into a restaurant or a cafe or somewhere, they're fantastic. The waitresses and waiters are just so much fun. They're relaxed with you, they're fun, they're great. So I think it's the people.
Dan?
It's a great city. There's a real heart and an atmosphere to the place. And I was tempted to say that my favourite thing was Steve Rotherham, because I think he's...
brownie point.
Always looking for brownie points, Angela. But I think Steve Rotherham is doing a fantastic job.
He is.
I think you're not going to let me get away with saying Steve Rotherham. So I'm just going to go a little bit old school. And I have to say, and I've given this a bit of thought since I arrived in Liverpool, I just think it's the Beatles.
I knew he was going to sing.
So predictable.
But can you think of any musical group that has had more influence around the world than the Beatles? And they are rooted in this city, so I'm going to say the Fab Four.
Well, my favourite is the Hot Water Comedy Club, which I appeared at last night, not doing stand-up, but I was with Jackie Smith doing our For the Many podcast with Johnny Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, who was outrageously funny. I mean, who would have thought?
Oh, he's great.
And you can listen to this if you... you need to... I don't let your kids listen to it, is all I can say. It's on the For the Many podcast on Wednesday, so... do have a listen to that, because it was a very, very funny night. Right, thank you very much indeed.
Thank
Angela,
you.
to Mary, to Dan. And Cross Question will be back tomorrow at the usual time of 8 o'clock. And in a moment, we're going to talk more about proportional representation. I'd love to hear your views. Do you think the electoral system needs changing? Or do you think, as Dan Jarvis thinks, it's all a bit indulgent and let's just move on? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's 3 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Governor of the Bank of England says it won't hesitate to change interest rates by as much as needed. Andrew Bailey says the bank is monitoring developments very closely after the pound fell to its lowest level against the US dollar. Professor Ian McCafferty, who served on its